Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alia Azariah. I am the Director of Aftercare for Safe House Project. I'm also a survivor, and it's my honor to get to bring these webinar series every month to you. We've been doing this since, I think, start of 2021 or 2020. And it's one of my favorite parts of my job because I am lucky enough to get to be in conversations with all sorts of amazing people all day, every day. And I know that direct service workers and people in related fields often don't get to be a part of those conversations. So the point of the webinar series is for me to really be able to bring those conversations to you all, for you to hear from experts on the different topics that we feel will benefit the field and point you in the direction of who can give you more information if this is something that deeply affects your work or something you want to know more about, that it's not us that are the experts, but the panelists that we bring on. And it's really just our honor to get to bring them in the up to you all. And so we're still kind of picking up numbers and having more people log on. But we will have time for question and answer, hoping. Well, I always try and make time for that at the end. So again, Safe House Project webinar series, we're excited to see you and we're gonna get the ball rolling. I'm really excited about this webinar. Something that I feel like I have had a lot of conversations about of all sides of kind of this issue and this service over the last few years. So we're going to be talking about just the importance of trauma-informed lawyering and the accessibility of that kind of a service and what it means to survivors to be able to have that. I know in my life, I've had a lot of these needs that have stemmed out of my own lived experience, whether they were family law needs, civil needs, criminal needs, and worked with a lot of survivors who, had all of those needs as well. And there are a lot of barriers, and we'll get into that, into accessing those needs. And so some people on today who I'm excited to get to introduce to you all, who've been able to either navigate through those themselves, help clients navigate through, or train or develop organizations that are working to fill that gap. So we're going to start with introductions here, and I'm going to start introducing my friend Jamie. Jamie has been kind of my point of contact on all things legal for the last few years. And I'm excited for you all to get to know her a little bit. Jamie Beck is the founder, president, and managing attorney of Free to Thrive, a nonprofit in Southern California that provides legal services, education, and policy advocacy for human trafficking survivors. She also serves as an expert witness in trafficking cases. She supports legal professionals working with survivors. She teaches trauma-informed legal skills at USC, and she's on the Dean's Board of Advisors for the University of San Diego School of Peace Studies. And before founding Free to Thrive, she practiced civil litigation and clerked for a federal judge. She's led significant advocacy, including helping to pass a law that allows trafficking survivors to clear criminal convictions related to their exploitation, the Justice for Survivors Act here in California. And she graduated from the University of San Diego School of Law. And so Jamie's been a good friend to me over the years, and excited to kind of have her expertise. She was the first person when I realized this was something I wanted to bring to you all in the webinar series, and she kind of pulled the rest of the panelists together. So grateful to have her expertise. And then we also have Wellnisha Sutton. Wellnisha is a survivor and lived experience expert dedicated to empowering those who've been impacted by injustice. She's got an extensive experience working with youth who've been trafficked or affected by commercial sexual exploitation, having served as a case manager for San Diego Youth Services at STARS and an advocate in both RISE and HOPE courts. Her work in diversion youth courts has allowed her to engage in restorative justice efforts within the juvenile justice system. She's passionate about the anti-trafficking movement, while Anisha believes in the power of survivor-centered services to help others heal, just as she's been able to overcome her own past experiences. She's also a powerful speaker on topics like human trafficking, racism, activism, and self-love, inspiring others to find their purpose and be their authentic selves. After leaving DC and graduating from the Human Trafficking Leadership Academy, she returned back to California, where she now advocates for youth impacted by the juvenile justice system with NCRC. And we're grateful to have her back in California, serving our youth here. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Remy Greenbaum. They, them is a clinical psychologist with a private practice and a non-clinical consulting business. They're also an adjunct professor at USC School of Law, co-teaching trauma-informed legal skills with Jamie. Dr. Greenbaum earned their PhD from Alliant International University under the mentorship of trauma expert Dr. Constance Dallenberg, completing a significant dissertation on the psychological impact of sexual exploitation. They work primarily as a trauma-informed psychotherapist with experience in various settings and are dedicated to supporting trauma survivors and educating others about trauma. So, as you can see, very qualified human beings that we have here today. I'm very excited to get to jump into just imparting their knowledge on all of you and hopefully pointing you into future conversations about how you can advocate better for survivors in whatever service it is that you're offering, because we know that this is a need that many, many survivors have touch the legal system. And so with that, let's ask what does trauma-informed lawyering entail? What is it, and why should it matter? Who wants to start us off? Jamie?
I'm happy to start at the highest level. And first of all, just thank you so much for having us. Thank you for, having a webinar on this topic. Thank you to my dear friends for being panelists with me. And I see many friends who are joining as well. So it's nice to see you all here. At the very, very highest level, there's 4 hallmarks of trauma-informed lawyering, and we can dive deeper into those as we have time. One is just understanding trauma and how it impacts your clients. Most lawyers do not have a baseline understanding of what trauma is and how it impacts behavior, memory, things like that. So we need to understand trauma in order to best serve our clients. We then need to adjust our attorney-client relationship, understanding how trauma impacts our clients. We need to adjust accordingly and really tailor our legal services to the specific needs and challenges that our clients have. And then we need to adapt our case strategy. And I've been talking to lawyers about this a bit more, that I think some lawyers adapt our case strategy in like a defensive posture of like, I know the barriers or challenges my client might have, and I'm going to adjust my case accordingly. That's a piece of it. But there's also a proactive, affirmative way to adjust our case strategy. Trauma impacts every piece of how humans interact and behave, which means that if you bring an understanding of trauma into your case, you can actually affirmatively support the facts of your case, support your client's story by helping the court, helping the other side understand trauma. And our legal system doesn't, like, not just lawyers, the legal system itself has no understanding of trauma. We can talk more about that. So it's really important for us as lawyers to also educate. And then the last piece is addressing vicarious trauma. That is something that I think all of us in this space who have any sort of understanding of trauma understand, that trauma impacts us, anybody working with trauma or trauma survivors. And as lawyers really struggle with mental health, with substance issues, with a lot of different issues. And we don't, in the legal profession, talk about that in the context of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. And it's really important that we put those challenges that lawyers have in that context.
Awesome.
Yeah, just to add to some of that. So trauma-informed practices really come out of the medical field for the most part, and then it's been adapted to a whole bunch of different fields. And like Jamie was saying, it really is about realizing how prevalent trauma is, recognizing the variety of impacts it will have on somebody, from the emotional, the psychological, the practical, the health issues that come about, particularly with trafficking survivors. And it's responding with a care for this instead of being apathetic to it or dismissive. It's saying, I'm going to put this at the forefront of how I interact with this person so that I make sure I resist efforts to harm a person. I work to repair healing and repair a sense of dignity and self and integrity. And it's about helping that individual build resilience as you work with them through their case. And there are kind of 6 overall principles to trauma-informed practices, which are basically like establishing safety, making sure people know where the bathroom is, making sure you're calling them by the right name and pronouns. It's establishing a lot of trust and being very transparent. It's encouraging peer support so they don't become reliant on one person or just you. it's inviting a lot of collaboration and mutual work. So it's saying, I will work with you, but you also have a role to do on your own here. So it's encouraging a lot of agency. And it's about empowerment, voice, and choice, and respecting the cultural, social, and political identities of those who you're working with.
And I totally agree with what they both said. And just to put it in like what it looks like kind of form, coming to Free to Thrive when Amy first started it, she met me in my community. She was like, "Where can we meet?" And then I was like, "In Southeast San Diego." And she's like, "Okay," found a space for us to meet. And just along my journey, even when I was working with my pro bono lawyers, she introduced me to them. She wasn't just like, "Okay, go here and do what you need to do." She was still involved, and I was still able to like contact her if I had questions or concerns or anything. She was always there for me. But then one pivotal thing that I won't ever forget, and I always tell, is like when I actually I had a warrant that was like 14 years old, just because I had completed everything the courts wanted me to complete. But I was so scared to go back to Orange County because of the racism, how they treated folks, and the stigma of like being a survivor. So I just kept the warrant, and I already had a story in my head of what I was going to tell the police if I ever got stopped. Because, you drive up and down the coast of California, and it was a misdemeanor warrant, y'all. Like, it wasn't anything big. I really just had to show that I had completed the HIV course. And so I told Jamie about it, and Jamie's like, "Okay, well, there was a pro bono lawyer that I worked with, and I just had some issues with her." And so I was like, "Jamie, I got to go up here to get this warrant cleared. Like, I'm nervous, I'm scared." She's like, "Do you want me to go with you?" I'm like, "What?" Like, she wasn't even my direct, I don't think she was my direct lawyer at the time. I think I had my pro bono lawyers. And then she was like, "Yeah, I'll go with you." And so she met up with me, drove me up there, explained to me like what I should expect. Mind you, all, like, I'm already a case manager. I'm already out of the life. I worked with people and did the same thing Jamie did for me, but it just hit differently, right? Because as you're going on your healing journey, sometimes you're like, crap, like the service that are allotted to folks today, they weren't allotted to us, right? So when you meet a Jamie and a Free to Thrive and you're still a survivor leader, and it's kind of like mind blowing. And so she drove up there with me, sat there with me, and just went through the process with me. And we had an amazing turnout. And even when we had to go downstairs to get the record sealed and everything destroyed, and they're like, what do we gotta do what? Like, they're like, this is unheard of. Jamie she talked for me and was there with me through the whole process. And because I was going through like, I was having triggers because I was in this space that I was nervous to be in this city that I don't really go to. But Jamie really made it easier for me. And I feel like that's like a great way the lawyers can be more trauma informed. I'm not saying you all need to stop what you're doing and drive folks an hour and a half away. But if you have that capacity and you really want to build like a real bond, these are the type of things that you have to do. And now Jamie and I are like, I wouldn't say we're besties, but I'm sure I know I'm one of her favorite clients, period.
Surprise me at all. And thank you for just being so vulnerable and sharing that. And I think you brought up like a really good point that it's not just clients in crisis, it's not just survivors in crisis that have these needs. I've had similar needs and definitely family law needs while I've been in this survivor leadership space, right? And been like speaking at Capitol buildings and all of this, and still like needed access to these services and found them hard to access as somebody who understands how to access services and reach out to people and can show up to meetings because I'm not in a trauma response all the time, and it's still very difficult to access. So moving into kind of this next question, and you touched a little bit on this already, Wilnisha, so feel free to jump back in as the first one or someone else does, whoever wants to jump in. Why is access to this trauma-informed legal services so critical for survivors?
I think because it's something new, like trauma informed is this new, of course, it's not as new to us, right? We've been hearing it for like the last 10 plus years, but to put it in practice. Like I tell people all the time, yeah, you have your certificate, you're trauma informed, but are you really trauma practice? Like, do you really do the work? Because it's a lot of introspective work that needs to be done in order to really show up, not just for you all, for us survivors as well, right? And so I think the problem is like we come from a system that's broken, right? And it is inherently like filled with white supremacy, biases, all privileges and all those things, and folks are not willing to face that. It's hard to look those ugly things in the face and to see like, oh, I do have this inside of me, and how do I go about fixing it? It's not easy. And so I feel like it's kind of hard for folks to be human in these spaces because it's not even made for folks to be human. It doesn't seem like the justice system, like you have to stick to these laws most of the time, and that's it. And that just sucks. Like it really does, especially for like us older survivors. I see there's a lot of opportunities for like the younger survivors now. And I'm so grateful for that. And we have a lot of divergent courts and systems for them. And I love that for them. At the same time, like there's folks that are out of the life that are working and surviving, but they still have these barriers, and they're nervous to go back because they're like, they don't have a Jamie, they don't have a Remy there to support them and to educate them. Like I'm privileged in that way, and I honor my privilege as a survivor leader to have worked with Free to Thrive.
I really appreciate what you mentioned there about older survivors and survivor leaders. In my dissertation study, where I interviewed about 50 survivors in a mixed method study, about half of them or more were survivor leaders. And what we actually found was that survivor leaders had just as much PTSD as the younger survivors, and if not more. And it's complex trauma. And additionally, we know that when we tell our trauma story, that's going to impact our symptomology. And the first person that we tell our trauma to really does matter. There's been a study that showed that the first person somebody tells someone that they've been sexually assaulted, if that person responds badly, it increases their likelihood of getting PTSD by 50%. So think about that. As a lawyer, you might be the first person somebody is actually being willing to tell their trauma to. And if you say something that's shaming, you give them a look that just makes them feel uncomfortable and don't kind of own it, or you just disregard it, that's going to add to their trauma responses and their way of relating to others in society. And it's going to create more barriers for them getting help. It's going to add more trauma into our world. And it's just going to keep rippling. So without trauma informed lawyering, we're adding more harm.
And just completely agree, and of what was just said. And I've often been the first person that my clients have shared their story with. They haven't told anybody, and they may be out of the life for a decade and have never told anybody. So that really, how you respond when a client discloses any type of traumatic experience too is incredibly important. And also, being patient, knowing that they are not going to tell you the worst things that ever happened to them when you sit down the first time to talk, and you shouldn't expect that. Another piece of, what Wilnisha was talking about in terms of the legal system being not only triggering, but not trauma informed. We have to remember that our clients, the experiences that they've had in the legal system, when we're talking about a client population, specifically of trafficking survivors, the systems have harmed them in so many different ways. Many of them, a third of our clients are former foster youth, so they were already in a difficult situation. Many of them were harmed within that system. Then they were criminalized because of the harm that they suffered. They're being victimized and trafficked, and instead of being identified as a victim, they're treated as a criminal in the system. They are taken from their parents. They are, every single time that they've been in court, it has been a traumatic experience. So that means the legal system alone is traumatic, and they're predisposed not to trust you because every lawyer they've ever encountered, unfortunately, or the vast majority, have not, maybe they haven't been trauma informed, or maybe they've been in a moment that even if the lawyer is doing the best that they can, they're in a situation, like if they're in the juvenile justice system and that lawyer's representing them, that situation is extremely traumatic for that individual. And so they associate lawyers and court with trauma, with harm, and then they come into a system that does not understand their experience. It does not understand trafficking. It does not understand trauma, and they're further harmed by that system. And we, as trauma-informed lawyers, have to, one, understand that our clients come predisposed not to trust us, and predisposed to be like triggered by this system alone, which means they're going to come into every meeting with you triggered, and walk alongside them and meet them where they're at and understand that, and also advocate for them in that system and help the system help reduce the harm of that system on our clients going forward.
And I'm going to ask a question that wasn't in the outline, and so I apologize for throwing everyone off maybe for a second, but I'm sure you'll be able to handle it. Because I feel like a lot of the folks on here right now are either trauma-informed professionals, or I think that they could benefit from understanding how we understand a little bit more about what trauma-informed lawyering is and why it's important, but how does it differ from the lawyering that most survivors currently have access to?
Okay, so let me start by the reason that Dr. Greenbaum and I teach a class on trauma-informed lawyering at USC Law School is because of my personal experience starting as a lawyer in, at a big law firm, practice civil litigation for 5 years, and then start working with trafficking survivors. And all that time in private practice and law school, I never had any training on trauma then. And I didn't realize until looking back on it, I was working on some really heavy trauma cases as a civil litigator with no training or background understanding about trauma. Then I stepped into the human trafficking space, and everything I learned about trauma was I'd go to human trafficking conferences where it would be trauma training for advocates, for mental health professionals, but there really wasn't anything specifically for lawyers. And I realized that, most of us working with trauma every day as attorneys learn this on our own. We learn it by practicing. And I am certain that I did many things early on that were not trauma informed because I didn't have the proper training and education. And I'm really passionate about teaching law students on this topic because it should be foundational. It should be something that all lawyers learn before they go into the system and cause further harm. But unfortunately, this is a really innovative course. We actually had to develop the curriculum ourselves because it did not exist. And, it's my understanding is maybe you get a lecture in a class, one lecture in a semester-long course on trauma, but there are very few, if any, courses where the entire course is on this subject. And then the challenge is that lawyers are going into the field without this education, without this training. And like we've talked about, they can really do additional harm. And the other piece is that it's not a one-time thing. Even the students that take our class, like they take our class, but being trauma-informed, we call it the practice of law. And we as lawyers understand that we are always practicing. You never and this may freak out people who've worked with lawyers, we never know what we're doing because it's ever evolving, constantly changing. The laws are changing, the rules are changing, and we have to constantly adapt and learn. And so we call it practicing. And it's really humble, right? We call it practicing. We need to practice trauma-informed lawyering. It is not like I took a class, I attended the class at USC, or I did a 2-hour training and now I'm trauma-informed. No, it has to be a constant learning journey and embedded into the fabric of any organization and an ongoing basis. If an organization does a training, it can't be a one-time training. It has to be annual training that is continuously updated.
Well, there's so many parts to focus on too within the training, right? Each one could focus on a different part of being trauma informed. And within that, I know we're focusing a lot on the impact of not being trauma informed on survivors, but the impact of not being trauma informed on the lawyer is just as great. We know that lawyers have some of the worst mental health outcomes in the country. We know that there's high rates of alcoholism, depression, high rates of suicidality at this point. And the stigma to get mental health support is so bad that y'all are suffering terribly with all of this trauma work that you're doing and developing your own trauma symptoms and not getting help. And if you have a foundational understanding of what trauma is, what is the impact of working with trauma on the day-to-day, you can mitigate some of the harmful impacts that will come to you through this work. I know Jamie and I have both spoken openly about our experiences with vicarious trauma and burnout. And if we had had better training early on, both from my field where it is also not very much taught, we both maybe could have staved off some of the severity of the symptoms that we had. And if you are being trauma informed with your client and your client is responding better to you, your work is going to be easier. You will feel more fulfilled in your work and you will be able to walk away really proud of what you did, knowing that you both help somebody in the legal sense and you help them in their personal journey, which I think is really a pretty good reason to become trauma informed.
I totally agree. And just like, it could seem like a lot of what Jamie and, that Remy just talked about. It is a lot, right? You're like, dang, I've been doing this wrong. Don't beat yourself up, y'all. Like, this is something that we're all learning and we're all growing together with. Even as survivor leaders, we have to get training, and we've messed up with other survivors and in the system. So, and we have to go home and process that, right? And choose to, if we're going to show up differently when that opportunity presents itself, or we're going to show up the same. So we all have to do our work, you all. Like, we all have to continuously heal and like take accountability for our stuff, and understand that this system was created before we all got into it. It doesn't really allow lawyers to be humans. Like, you guys have to show up, you got to do this case, you got to do it fast, and then you got to go to the next one. And don't be a public defender. It's really a lot. So I empathize and sympathize with y'all, and we are truly appreciated for all the work that you do. I would just encourage you, like, just continuously do your work. When stuff pops up, check yourself and see, like, and have friends that hold you accountable. Like Jamie, we hold each other accountable in love, right? And we'll let each other know, and we have tough conversations. Like, and Jamie, I've seen her over and over do her work and change and grow and become like this champion in this space, right? But I know it's not always easy. And I know I used to always tell her, Jamie, what's up with your self-care? Like, what are you doing? Where are you going? How you doing? Like, what's up? And she'd be like, I know, Wilnisha, I know, I'm just trying to do this work. I'm like, that's great. But if you burn out, we might not ever get another Jamie. So then we're at a disadvantage. So you got to take care of you. So we need all of y'all 130, 60 participants and everyone on this panel. We got to continuously take care of ourselves, y'all. Like, this work is going to be here. And also, I just want to say, like, survivors and folks that we serve that have been through a lot of trauma, they have a capacity to understand. You don't have to show up perfect. They probably have more capacity of understanding and love and empathy than the system would. So, like, even if you told them, like, hey, I messed up yesterday, when you told me about your story, my facial expression was probably just like a certain way, because I couldn't believe you went through that. They're probably like, oh, it don't matter, or whatever. And maybe they'll process it later, and maybe, but just showing up as a real human, y'all.
I was just gonna say, I'm so glad you said that, Alicia. It's so true. I find our clients endlessly, able to hold space for us. And the really important piece is taking accountability for your actions. Is part of being trauma informed is, if you mess up, say you messed up, take accountability and move on. And our clients, when you do that, are completely understanding. When you don't, they're extremely frustrated, and that's causes further harm.
Yeah, we thank you again. I couldn't agree more, Wilnisha. And we talked a little bit about some of the barriers, right? Barriers with the way that kind of the system works, barriers with the way that lawyers are trained and taught, and their access to mental health services themselves. Are there any additional barriers that survivors face in advocating these types of services, and what can advocates, because we have a lot of non-lawyers on, right? People who are assisting survivors in accessing services, what steps can they take to ensure that their clients get access to this kind of care? Jamie, why don't you start us off?
Okay, I see everyone's thoughts moving. I think the biggest barrier is there's just a serious lack of legal services for survivors, period, let alone trauma-informed legal services. There was a really incredible research study that the Avery Center did in collaboration with the National Survivor Law Collective called Legal Deserts. And there was 2 reports that we put out together. And the first one talked about that there literally are deserts around the country. There's entire states or sections of the United States where there are no legal services that are specifically for survivors, which means legal services that are trained on human trafficking and trained on trauma. And that's a huge challenge. So if you live in an area that has any legal services, let alone like not even talk about the quality of those services, that's a privilege in this country, unfortunately. And then, so what advocates can do is really think creatively. And really, I think one of the amazing things about advocates is you all can be incredibly creative and there's another word that's not coming to mind, but really pushing past, like you see a barrier and you push past it. And so, look outside of just human trafficking legal services, look more broadly in your community, because most communities will have a legal aid organization. Many will have other types of like reentry legal services, like an expungement clinic, and they may not be a human trafficking specific program. They may not even be trauma informed, which is a challenge, but that's where I would start, and then offer them training on human trafficking, offer them training on trauma informed practices. And, just so you know, Remy and I are always available to do training on trauma informed lawyering. We had one organization find our syllabus and reach out to us and say, can you do the trauma informed lawyering for us? And we said, okay. We thought they'd want like a 2-hour train. They're like, no, we want the entire course. We want you to teach the class to our whole staff. And we are so excited for opportunities like that, because those of us who didn't learn it in law school, we still need to learn this. But, bring those resources to those services and meet them where they're at, because they're often really well intended. They believe in serving this population and want to help, and they just may not be able to.
I would just say, like, as someone who is an advocate, just be there with them, like, hold the lawyers accountable. Or sometimes, sometimes it's just tough to, once you're telling your story again over and over, it's just hard to do that, right? So maybe they need you to be an accomplice sometimes. Of course, follow their lead, but if they're, they got to follow up with their lawyer, then maybe you can do that for them. Just one task, just certain things. Of course, they have to lead the way and they have to put in the work, but just walk alongside them. And, like when Jamie drove me up there, like, just drive with me, ride with me, and talk to me and let me know like what to expect. Or even if you don't know, like, hey, I don't know what to expect. We're going through this journey together. You're one of the first ones. Like, even me knowing like I'm one of the first survivors in California to get criminal vacature, like, I love it. Like, that's so great, right? So like, you can tell survivors that and they'll hold on to that gem, because that's something that, they're going to be proud of. And it might be tough, but if these folks are very resilient. And as an advocate, for you to even have the ability to want to serve in that capacity, because we do a lot of work as advocates and the pay is not always up, don't always equal up. So obviously you're doing it for, I hope for reasons that are well intended. Just go with them on the journey, be that accomplice that they need.
Yeah, I think you guys pretty much covered it. And being not in the legal field, I don't have as much to maybe say on this one, but within the advocacy space, I think one of the things that we forget is to empathize sometimes, because we want to solve problems, we want to like make it all better, and sometimes we just need to express that this really sucks and that the system is failing you, and really emphasize where the legal system is the problem and society is the problem, so that the survivor doesn't put it all on themselves, because that's so common that it becomes a self-blame, self-shame thing. And if we're just like, oh yeah, that's too bad, that's too bad, oh well, the system is almost there but it's not quite, no, it's okay to say, no, the system is failing you, it is failing you hard, and I'm sorry, I can't make it any different right now, but what I can do is say, I see that, I'm here with you, and like, let's keep exploring all the resources we can around us.
Did y'all see how they felt? Did
Oh,
y'all
sorry.
feel that? Sorry. Did you
No.
see how they felt when they said that? Like, that right there is just so powerful. Like, and then it lets the survivor know too. Sorry, Jamie, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead.
It lets the survivor know too, like, hey, this person is with the program, like they're on the same page as me, they understand my struggles, and understanding like the system is easier for folks that don't look like most of the survivors look like, right? And once you say that and you name that, then you can even go further with the survivor. But if you're just coming off as a lawyer, like, I work for the system and or advocate, and I'm trying to here to say, no, like the system sucks and we're here, we're trying to change it together. This is why we're all together. Then they're going to be like, wow, I could really trust this person more. That's how I felt about Jamie. Jamie was always real with me and letting me know like about the system. I'm like, oh, that's my girl. Then I could talk to her about everything. Now I know she can hold capacity for me. She has space for me because she's being real and authentic. Because we're leading with our trauma, y'all, as survivors. I'm a survivor leader. You know that I'm a survivor. I don't know what Jamie's been through. I don't know what Remy's been through, right? They're not leading with their trauma. So with that, like, we need y'all to open up and to empathize and to show your heart. Like, there's a heart right now in the chat.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychology began with the blank slate therapist. You know, the therapist doesn't show any emotion and we just stay there. And as lawyers, that's often taught too. It's like, don't show any emotion, just kind of write your notes and go through the experience. But what we found is that actually doesn't help people that much. We want people to empathize with us. We want to see them care about what we're going through. And we're going to sit and interpret their face when they're talking to us. And I know I've said face a few times, so don't be too paranoid about that, but just like own your face. But, you know, we need to communicate how we feel with someone for the other person to also feel connected to, so that they have a perspective of their own experience. And additionally, for us, we know that we have increased risk of vicarious trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder if we don't embrace the moment we're in fully. If we're sitting there holding back our real emotions and hiding everything that we're going through, we will need to process that out later for sure. And if we don't, that's going to just build up in us and build up in us. And this isn't to say to make it about you. Do not do that. But it is to say, man, that was really hard to hear. Give me a second. I want to take a breath. Like, that was really fucked up that that happened to you. I'm not okay with that. And I'm going to be upset here for a second because I'm upset on your behalf. So give me a few breaths here. What would that mean to a survivor to say, I care that that happened to you enough that I'm upset here. I get the chills because of that situation you went through. It makes you feel seen, cared for, makes you feel like what you went through was as severe as what you feel it is, and not as not severe as the trafficker maybe wanted you to feel, or as society wants you to feel, or as the legal system makes you feel when you are stressing every day trying to get things moving forward and it just keeps stalling you.
Yes. Thank you so much for speaking that, both of you. Remy, you gave me the chills when you said that. It's so true. And it's a balance. Like, I will say that finding that balance between one, like having professional boundaries with your client and also showing up for them when you need to. And for me, if I let a little emotion out, it's all going to come out. And if I'm in court, I can't do that. So I really need to keep myself together in that moment and be strong for my clients. But as Remy mentioned, if I do not let those feelings out, it will come out in other ways and it will manifest in really unhealthy ways. And I've learned that, and I'm still working on like how to process out those emotions, because it's hard not in real time to do that. We can dive more into that, but it's really challenging. It's something I struggle with, but it's really, really important. The other thing, I wanted to directly address something that was mentioned in the chat. You know, Meredith mentioned that legal aid won't assist survivors if they're getting charges related to the case, even though they're a victim. This is one space in terms of post-conviction work of record clearing that I want to mention, that there are a couple of national organizations where you can hopefully find help for survivors. One is the Freedom Network Survivor Reentry Project, is a national program to help survivors with record clearing. There's also a couple of other organizations. Alight and the Joseph Project are ones that you can look into. And then if those don't work, you can reach out to the National Survivor Law Collective. You can reach out to me personally. We have a national listserv for lawyers where we reach out. Does anybody know somebody who does this in this area? And so you can always reach out to somebody or an organization that's a part. Alight is a part of it. There's a bunch of other organizations. I'm not going to name them all, but you can reach out to any of us and we can then reach out to our network and see if we can find somebody.
And of course, you know, people are going to want those. So Jamie, if you can email them to me, and I will include links to those organizations in the email, which if you're here, don't worry, you will receive the email. And that means you will receive the names of those organizations as well, because I know that's probably, you know, the number one question on people's mind is like, what's the easiest way for me to access those services for myself, for my client, for people I might come in contact with. So say that someone does live in kind of these legal deserts or without access to trauma-informed legal services. How could they encourage the legal professionals in their area to meet this ethical obligation and become trauma-informed?
I think the first thing we can always do is ask. Like, if you keep emailing them and letting them know, like, I'm looking for a lawyer, I will only work with someone who has trauma-informed training. What are you doing to fulfill this? And you get kind of your whole community emailing them a lot. People are going to listen. They want your money, they want your business. So if that's what's going to get them to hear you, it might be worth just continually emailing.
I would say too, if they don't have like the services connecting to Free to Thrive, like Jamie has trained countless lawyers on how to be trauma informed and in this space. So send them her way, their way.
And thank you. And I'll just add to that. I've been thinking a lot about how to get disinterested lawyers to engage in trauma training because I'm getting it's really there's definitely a generational gap, and there's kind of this like generation of lawyers who think they think it's woo-woo, BS, nonsense. They don't know what it is, they don't care, they have no interest in it. And I really had to sit with that because to me it's so obvious that I had to really sit with like, well, how do I get these folks who are not engaged? And the answer that I came up with is, reminding them of their ethical obligations to their clients, their ethical obligations as lawyers. We have a whole body of law that tells lawyers about the ethics that we have to practice. I know a lot of people who've had bad experience with lawyers may be surprised to know that. And it's really important. And lawyers do, despite what you may think about lawyers, we do take our ethical responsibilities extremely seriously, and we can get disbarred. We can lose our license to practice law if we violate those ethical obligations. And so there is a tie-in, and I actually just went through that rules of ethics and found, I'm not going to name them all, bore you all with some legal ethics, but there are tons and tons of rules of ethics that directly intersect with trauma-informed lawyering. And so my plan, my goal, my strategy is to use ethical obligations as a way to get lawyers to engage in this. And when they learn, oh, ethics requires me to do this, okay, fine, I'll learn about this thing. And then hopefully they will then buy in once they kind of get past that initial threshold of buy-in.
Yeah. And as a reminder, like there isn't one practice of law that isn't affected or couldn't be affected by this, or that there isn't a survivor need for, right? Like there are civil needs, there are vacatur needs, there are policy needs, like there's those macro needs, there's contract needs, there's all of these other like practices of law that are not kind of what we think of as far as like criminal or family law that survivors need access to. I mean, prosecutors, right? We've talked about this extensively, Jamie and I, then the need for prosecutors to have this, public defenders to have this. And so feel free. I give you all permission to feel free to put pressure on your lawyers that are in your sphere or interact with your clients to access this kind of training and to hold them accountable, because that is, I mean, that's how we've gotten to this point as a field, as an anti-trafficking field, is by holding each other and the related systems accountable. And this is another system that we need to start bringing into the mix and bringing into kind of our sphere of influence of people that we hold accountable. I'm going to shift into question and answer, and then hopefully we'll circle back for some final thoughts. One person's question I feel like we answered, which was amazing, is they do have like specific questions around a Facebook group or a website. So Jamie, when you email me, just anything that you could give, I promise I will send out by early next week to everyone who has registered for the training. We'll get that email. And then Helen, Jamie, I think this question is kind of for you. She attended one of your trainings earlier this year, and what she found to be substantially important was the HT 101 elements that you integrated into that. And do you incorporate HT 101 in the trauma-informed lawyering class that you teach in the curriculum?
So the class is trauma-informed learning generally. It's not a specific class, but given that both my experience and Dr. Greenbaum's experience is largely with trafficking survivors, we do use a lot of HT 101 and a lot of case examples related to working with survivors. I will say that each training that I do, and I know Dr. Greenbaum is the same, we really tailor it to the audience that we're training. So if it's a group that will be working specifically with trafficking survivors or with an intersecting population, that's always something that I would include in that training. And it also depends on time and capacity. It might need multiple trainings.
Great. And then I think this is a great question. This next one, it's anonymous person, they said in Texas, they have a mandated human trafficking training for healthcare providers at each 2-year license renewal period. Do you think a state mandated human trafficking training for lawyers would be received in the legal communities? Not given that not all lawyers work with survivors.
As a non-lawyer, I'll just jump in really quick and say that most people don't want to do the trainings you're required to do. So it's not about, I think, if they're going to receive it well, it's more about this is something that would be really valuable for you. We hope you'll receive it well. We'll hope you engage with it, but whether or not you want to receive it, it's valuable information for you. And every time they add in a new training that even us psychologists have to do, I know there's always this resistance, like, oh, I have to do 6 more hours of suicidality training, right? But it's actually really valuable for me. So I think we have to not necessarily care about our initial resistance to it, but say, why is this valuable for me? Even if I don't work with survivors I'm directly working with trafficking survivors, but trafficking is everywhere. It happens in all spaces of life. So being aware of it can make me a more attuned lawyer. It can make me a more attuned person out in the world. I can see things that other people can't now because of this training, even if I didn't really want it.
Just adding on to that, I do think that there would be resistance for all the reasons that Dr. Greenbaum said. I think, you can kind of break the legal profession into two big buckets, and there's other buckets, but the two main buckets are criminal and civil. On the civil side, we know that trafficking survivors are in all types of civil cases, but I think it's not like survivors are there. I think there's a need for training, but not nearly as prevalent as on the criminal side. We know the data is just completely appalling in terms of the criminalization of survivors. One survey found that 90% of sex trafficking survivors had been criminalized during and as a result of their exploitation. And I think that there's this idea in the criminal legal system of like, oh, we're not really prosecuting prostitution anymore, so therefore we've solved the problem, which we have not. The vast majority of charges that we see on our clients' records at Free to Thrive are not prostitution. And as we get further and further away from criminalizing survivors for engaging in prostitution, then we will see less and less of that. But we continue to see survivors in criminal cases on all types of legal issues. And I spent some time with some public defenders yesterday who were in a misdemeanor courtrooms, and they're, some were in misdemeanor court, just like general misdemeanors, and some were in DV court. And they were sharing with me how many, and these are people who have, a background or an understanding of human trafficking. And thankfully they do, because they're identifying client after client after client. They said in the last 4 weeks, they've identified 4 survivors in these courtrooms. And they're like, we know that we're just scratching the surface, but we really think that we're missing people. And then when we do identify them, what do we do? And so we were having this conversation about training within their office, developing protocols of how you identify people, and then what happens when they're identified, and diverting them to services, which is really what we need for survivors, is instead of being treated like criminals, to be able to access services to heal from their trauma. But this is something that we need across the board. Defense attorneys, prosecutors need to understand human trafficking and understand that there are victims and survivors in all of their cases, and they don't. The system is just woefully broken and missing people. And we've seen some really high profile cases lately of some just really horrific stories of survivors who are being criminalized. So I don't believe we're going to get get it to be statewide mandated, but I really hope that we'll get to a point where defense organizations, public defenders' offices and prosecutors' offices have, in their office, mandatory human trafficking training. That's my current goal right now. So if you want to talk more about that, reach out to me offline.
But there's other ways through other kinds of policies, right? To ensure that even if they don't have the training, they still have the ethical obligation, if they're, especially in those criminal cases, depending on the state, right? So like in our state, like there is that, Jamie knows the penal code, I don't, but there is that penal code where if trafficking is like, if the defendant has a history of trafficking, that needs to be considered in every element of the case, right? And so if your state doesn't have something like that, like that's a different avenue to have. Jamie, you go, you're the lawyer.
No, you're totally, I don't need to say anything. No, it's exactly right. And in California, we passed AB 124, which requires, as you said it perfectly, which requires defense and prosecution attorneys to bring the facts related to somebody's, and it's human trafficking, interpersonal violence and sexual violence. It becomes relevant to the case, which means you have to know about these things. You have to identify it within your clients, and you have to take it into account as a prosecutor. So it's now something that is relevant. It is necessary, and passing laws like that. Oklahoma just passed a law. They overcame a gubernatorial veto in Oklahoma. Yay, Oklahoma! You advocates who are fighting for this law crushed it. That allows for resentencing of survivors, and then also going forward, it to be taken into account into their cases. New York has a resentencing law, but this is like the beginning. And just to give you like a little historical context, is when I first got into this space in like 2013, 11 states in the United States had vacatur laws. Now all but 2. Alaska just joined us with the vacatur law this year. Go Alaska. So we have come in the last decade. It has taken a decade of all of us advocates fighting tooth and nail to change the laws. And I feel like the next wave, vacatur was the first. The next wave, I believe, is moving upstream. Vacatur is after the fact. Vacatur is somebody has already been through this really messed up system, have been harmed by the system, treated as a criminal, and now they're, we're trying to clear their record. We need to go upstream into cases, resentencing for survivors who are still serving time, and then having, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges take it into account at the trial level so we don't continue to harm survivors who are criminalized. So that's where the laws are going. Look to California's AB 124, look at Oklahoma, look at New York for examples, and then go to your state legislature and say, these laws need to be in our state too. And again, you want to talk about that offline? I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I was gonna definitely say, like, this is the process, y'all. Like, if you would have told me 15 years ago that when I was being like a prostitute that I would be able to have these services, I wouldn't have believed you. But now we have them, right? And then Jamie, when even I don't know what that with Jamie, even when we started this process, I don't think we had criminal vacature, so we had to go through that journey. And it's wow, even with my vacature, and I didn't, my cases were not, they were horrible, but they weren't hard. Like I just had like prostitute, intent to prostitute. I didn't have like robbery or then like, these felony cases, but it still took us like 2 years, 3 years almost to get to the process of getting the vacature. And then one thing that I always talk about as well that was like very healing and transformative was that when Jamie did take me to Orange County, and I don't know who this lawyer, we might need to reach out to that lawyer, Jamie, and see, I mean, the judge, and see if he can train other judges. But we were like in a court setting that was like for like tickets, like, just a regular court setting where everybody comes in there, sits down, they call you up, and then, you state your case and vase, vase. And so we had just got to court. We always said, well, I was tired, y'all. We had just walked up the stairs. I don't know how Jamie did it in the hills, but we had just walked up the stairs and we get in the court and he's like, okay, I want to see what Nisha said. And I'm like, crap, like I ain't even got to sit down and breathe. And so Jamie was not my representative lawyer, but she was just there supporting me and making sure the lawyer did what she was supposed to do. So I get to the part where I'm talking to the judge and he's like, well, Nisha, I'm just proud of you. And, I read over your whole declaration and it was so powerful. And I'm like, dang, he's about to tell the whole court what I did. Like, and he was like, and who did this work? I thought he was talking about the declaration, y'all. I'm like, yeah, my lawyers. He's like, no, you did this work. I'm like, oh, yeah. I did this work to change my life. And he's like, yeah. And I'm so proud of you, like as a judge, and I'm just honored to stand before you. And he was like, I'm definitely going to grant this for you. And can I come off my bench and shake your hand? And I'm like, what? Right? And I was like, sure. And so then he came off his bench, shook my hand, and I was just like, what the heck just happened? And that was so restorative because in just helping my healing journey, because like I said, that space was very hard for me to go to. And when I was in there, it was hard for me to be there. But having that experience definitely gave me faith in the justice system. Not really in the system, in us, because we are the system, like it gave me hope in us that even a judge, he was a white presenting judge as well, like would come off his bench and honor like, me as a survivor and a woman of color in my whole journey. So yeah. It took a while to get here though, and we still have a while to go, but that's okay.
But it took 5 minutes of his time,
Right?
right, to do this incredibly impactful thing. I cry on Zoom calls all the time. I don't I could use my like putting my emotions back in place would be great. But okay, we have a couple more questions, but this one I know is the one that's probably I'm gonna get all the emails about, and people are asking in the chat. If somebody has a law firm, wants training, if somebody knows a law firm that wants training, wants to point their like hold the legal professionals in their world accountable, advocate for something like this in their prosecutor's office, their DA's office, where do we point them? How do they do that? What does that look like? Yeah, Jamie's email's in the chat.
I just put my email in the chat. If you're interested in this training, please reach out to me, reach out to Dr. Greenbaum. We're happy to chat with you offline about, what's needed in your community and how we can support you.
And I'll include Jamie in that email in the after action email that I send out. And then one last question, because we didn't talk a lot about family law. We have 3 minutes and we've got a question here. Have you had especially good experiences having success in family court, or what are what are the best practices there? Maybe anything you can say about family court?
I I sigh because the Legal Deserts report specifically mentioned family law as one of the major gaps for survivors. Unfortunately, there are very limited services. There are some organizations that do specifically family law for survivors, but they're few and far between, which means going back to that strategy we talked about, which is though there's a lot of organizations that provide family law, but not specific for trafficking survivors. So going to those organizations and encouraging them to get training on trauma-informed practices, training on trafficking. I've done a lot of family law work, worked on a lot of restraining orders, custody and divorce cases, and actually in LA going to be speaking at a family law symposium early next year on trauma-informed practices. Like these are the types of things we need. The family law bar, there's bar associations, bar organizations specifically for family lawyers. We need them to get this training too. So again, reach out and we can talk about it. And also we can also help identify resources that are either closer to you or in your community.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I hear you that this is something you want to hear more about. I hope we get to have this conversation more and more. And just thank you, Nisha, Jamie, and Remy for being just so open and willing to share just your expertise with us. Thanks.